She took everything from him and thought he would stay silent. Lucas trusted her with everything the moment he crossed the border. His money, his papers, his future. She said she would help him start over. Said he was safe now. But every night, Lucas noticed something missing. A document moved, a phone that went silent, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then one evening, he opened the drawer where his passport should have been. Empty. On the table, a single note. Not signed. Just 3 words that made his chest tighten. She thought Lucas was too afraid to speak, too invisible to fight back. But what she didn't know was what Lucas had already seen. Lucas stood in the narrow kitchen long after the light outside the window faded, holding the note between his fingers as if it might burn him if he closed his hand. The apartment smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and overcooked rice, a smell that had once made him feel sheltered and now only reminded him how carefully everything had been arranged. He read the 3 words again, slowly, as though repetition might change their meaning, but the message stayed firm and deliberate in its silence. The absence of a signature felt intentional, a final erasure rather than an oversight, and it told him more than any explanation could have. His chest tightened not with panic, but with a dull pressure of recognition, the kind that settles when something feared finally confirms itself. He realized he had been waiting for this moment since the first night. He noticed her smile falter when she thought he was asleep. The safety she had promised him had always required his obedience, his gratitude, his quiet. Standing there now, Lucas felt the last thin thread of that agreement snap inside him. He sat at the small table and placed the note flat against the wood, aligning its corners with care as if order might restore control. His hand shook only slightly, and he noticed this with mild surprise, because he had expected fear to take over completely. Instead, what rose was a careful inventory of memories, each one re-examined under a harsher light. He remembered how she insisted on keeping his documents locked away for protection, how she framed it as kindness while watching his reaction closely. He remembered the way she answered calls in another room, lowering her voice even when he wasn't near. At the time, he had explained it away as stress, as the price of her helping him. Now, each memory rearranged itself into something sharper, something that cut through his earlier gratitude. He understood that his silence had been mistaken for weakness, not patience. That realization settled into him with unsettling calm. Lucas pushed his chair back and walked through the apartment slowly, touching familiar objects as if confirming they still existed. The couch where he had slept his first night in the country looked smaller now, less forgiving in its sagging cushions. He paused by the door to her bedroom, noticing the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, a scent he once associated with reassurance. He did not open the door, sensing that whatever lay beyond it would not offer answers, only more evidence of control. Instead, he leaned his forehead briefly against the wall, closing his eyes and steadying his breath. He thought of the border crossing, the fear that had hollowed him out, and how her voice had seemed like an anchor then. That voice had promised him invisibility as safety, compliance as survival. Now, he wondered how deliberately those promises had been shaped. The thought did not break him, but it hardened something essential inside his chest. He returned to the kitchen and opened the drawer again, though he already knew it would be empty. The absence of his passport felt heavier than its physical weight ever had, like a deliberate removal of his name and history. He imagined in her hands, tucked into a folder, perhaps already being offered as leverage or currency. The idea that his future could be reduced to a bargaining chip filled him with a quiet, simmering anger. He had fled one kind of erasure only to be pressed into another, subtler one. The pattern was painfully familiar, and that familiarity was what frightened him most. He had sworn to himself that he would never again let someone decide who he was allowed to be. Standing there, he understood how easily desperation could rewrite that vow. Understanding it, however, also meant he could reclaim it. Lucas sat again, this time pulling his phone from his pocket and turning it over in his hands. The screen lit up, offering nothing but missed notifications that led nowhere, conversations that had ended without explanation. He thought about the nights when the phone had gone silent in her presence, how she would smile and say it was better not to attract attention. At the time, he had believed discretion was safety, that invisibility would keep him alive. Now, the silence felt engineered. Another layer of isolation wrapped around him. He scrolled through his contacts, stopping at names he had been too afraid to call. Fear had convinced him that reaching out would only make things worse. That belief, he realized, had been carefully encouraged. The phone vibrated once in his hand, a notification with no message, and his heart quickened. It felt like the world testing whether he was still willing to stay quiet. He stood and paced, the confined space amplifying the sound of his footsteps. Each step seemed to echo a question he had avoided since crossing the border. Who benefits from my silence? The answer unfolded around him in the tidy apartment, in the locked drawers, in the unsigned note. He remembered the look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, a calculating distance that disappeared when he met her gaze. That look returned to him now with clarity, stripped of the affection he had layered over it. He saw how carefully she had learned his fears, how precisely she had used them. This realization did not come with despair, but with a strange sense of relief. Monsters were easier to face once they stopped pretending to be saviors. He felt the first stirrings of resolve, fragile but unmistakable. Lucas opened the window slightly, letting in the sounds of the city beyond the apartment walls. Traffic hummed. Voices rose and fell, life continuing with indifferent momentum. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the knowledge that the world outside still existed and had not conspired against him. The city had been overwhelming at first, its scale reminding him how small he was. Now it felt like cover, like a place where he could disappear on his own terms rather than hers. He watched people pass below, each one absorbed in their own urgency, their own secrets. None of them knew his name, his story, or the contents of the note on his table. That anonymity, once terrifying, now hinted at possibility. He realized that being invisible could also mean being free from her gaze. The thought lingered, tentative but promising. He sat again, this time deliberately, and began to reconstruct the past weeks with methodical care. He noted the dates when his documents had last been present, the nights when she had insisted on locking the drawer herself. He recalled the names she had mentioned casually, contacts she claimed were helping but whom he had never met. Each detail aligned into a pattern that felt too consistent to dismiss. This was not chaos or misunderstanding. It was planning. The knowledge made his pulse steady rather than race. He understood that fear thrived in confusion, and clarity was its enemy. With clarity came choice, and with choice came responsibility. Lucas felt the weight of that responsibility settle on him, heavy but grounding. For the first time since arriving, the future felt like something he might shape rather than endure. The note still lay on the table, its 3 words staring up at him with quiet finality. He did not pick it up again, choosing instead to let it remain where it was, stripped of its power. He wondered how long she had believed him incapable of noticing, how long she had relied on his gratitude to blind him. That assumption, he realized, was her greatest mistake. Lucas had survived far worse than a stolen document and a silent threat. He had learned to observe without reacting, to wait without surrendering. Those skills, born of necessity, had sharpened his awareness rather than dulled it. Sitting there, he felt a shift occur, subtle but irreversible, as fear gave way to intention. The question was no longer whether he would speak, but when and who would finally be listening. Lucas did not sleep that night, though he lay on the couch with his eyes closed, listening to the apartment breathe around him. The refrigerator clicked on and off. Pipes groaned softly in the walls, and every sound felt amplified by the knowledge that something essential had shifted. He replayed conversations in his mind, her tone when she asked questions that felt casual but lingered too long, her insistence on knowing where he went and who he spoke to. At the time, he had mistaken attention for care, believing that being watched meant being protected. Now he recognized the structure of it, the quiet tightening of a net woven from concern and control. His heart did not race as it once would have, instead settling into a steady, deliberate rhythm. Fear had been replaced by something colder and more useful. In the darkness, Lucas began to plan not an escape, but confrontation with the truth. When morning came, light crept through the blinds and painted thin stripes across the floor. Lucas rose carefully, as if sudden movement might alert someone even though he was alone. He brewed coffee, the familiar routine grounding him, and noticed how the simple act felt different now that he understood the cost of complacency. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, his awareness sharpened by sleeplessness. He listened for sounds in the hallway outside, half expecting her key in the lock, but the apartment remained silent. The quiet no longer comforted him. It demanded attention. He realized how often silence had been used against him, stretched long enough to make him doubt his instincts. This time, he refused to fill it with excuses. He drank his coffee slowly, letting the bitterness anchor him in the present. Lucas checked the drawer once more, not out of hope, but confirmed resolve. The emptiness stared back at him, unchanged, and he nodded almost imperceptibly. He moved to the closet and opened his bag, the one he had crossed the border with, still packed with what little he owned. Tucked into an inner seam, carefully stitched and nearly forgotten, was a folded piece of paper he had carried for years. It was not a passport, but it was proof of something she did not know he had kept. He held it between his fingers, remembering the moment he had hidden it, driven by a quiet instinct to never give everything away. That instinct had been mocked by others as paranoia, but it had kept him alive more than once. Looking at it now, Lucas felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. She had not taken everything, because she had never truly seen him. He sat at the table again and unfolded the paper, smoothing it out as though it were fragile. The information on it was outdated, incomplete, but it told a story that contradicted the one she had been telling on his behalf. He thought of the agencies she claimed to contact, the offices she said required his documents. None of it had ever been verified by him, because he had trusted her certainty more than his doubt. That trust now felt like a liability he needed to dismantle piece by piece. He considered where she might have taken his passport, who might already know his name and status. The idea no longer paralyzed him, but sharpened his focus. If others were involved, then patterns existed, and patterns could be traced. He folded the paper again and slipped it into his pocket, feeling its reassuring weight. As the hours passed, Lucas ventured outside, stepping into the city with cautious intent. The street was busy, people moving with purpose, and he blended into the flow more easily than he had expected. He realized how often she had discouraged him from going out alone, framing it as concern for his safety. Now, walking among strangers, he felt less exposed than he ever had under her roof. Every face he passed reminded him that anonymity could be a shield rather than a threat. He noted storefronts, public offices, places where questions could be asked without her mediation. The city no longer felt hostile. It felt indifferent, and that indifference granted him space. He kept his head down, but his eyes stayed alert, cataloging exits and possibilities. This was not flight, he told himself, but reconnaissance. Lucas stopped at a small cafe and sat near the window, ordering with cash he had hidden from her careful accounting. As he waited, he watched the reflection of the street in the glass, noticing how easily one could observe without being noticed. He thought of her again, of the way she watched him, believing herself invisible in her scrutiny. The irony did not escape him. He realized that she had underestimated his capacity for patience, mistaking his quiet for emptiness. In truth, his silence had always been crowded with observation. He sipped his coffee and considered his next steps, aware that time mattered now. Whatever she was planning would continue whether he acted or not. The question was whether he would remain a subject of it or disrupt it entirely. Returning to the apartment later, Lucas sensed immediately that something had changed. The air felt disturbed, as if someone had moved through the space with purpose. He scanned the room, noting small differences that would have escaped before. A chair slightly out of place, the faint smell of her perfume fresher than it should have been. She had been there while he was gone. The realization sent a slow pulse of adrenaline through him, not fear, but alertness. He checked his bag and pockets, confirming nothing else was missing. The visit felt like a test, a reminder of who she believed held control. Lucas sat down and allowed the implication to settle. She was confident he would do nothing. He picked up the note again, reading the 3 words with renewed clarity. They no longer felt like a threat, but like a provocation. He imagined her expectation, the way she likely pictured him frozen by fear, waiting for instructions. That image no longer matched the man sitting at the table. Lucas felt a shift solidify inside him, a commitment forming quietly but firmly. He would not confront her blindly or rashly. He would gather what he needed, speak to who he needed, and when the time came, he would make himself impossible to ignore. The thought steadied him, grounding his resolve. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder not if he could fight back, but how far or certain he would collapse once he realized he already had. Lucas spent the next 2 days observing rather than acting, allowing routine to become camouflage while his attention sharpened. He stayed in the apartment longer than usual, leaving only when necessary, listening to the building's rhythms and the habits of its residents. Each sound in the hallway told a story he had previously ignored. Footsteps that lingered, doors that closed too softly, voices that stopped when he passed. He understood now how environments taught people what to notice and what to dismiss, and he regretted how quickly he had surrendered that awareness. The apartment had never been neutral. It had always belonged more to her than to him. That imbalance had shaped every interaction between them, quietly reinforcing who was allowed certainty and who was expected gratitude. Recognizing it made him angry in a controlled, focused way. Anger, he realized, could be disciplined if given direction. On the third morning, she returned while he was awake, her entrance announced by the familiar jingle of keys. Lucas remained seated at the table, posture relaxed, his expression deliberately neutral. She greeted him with a warmth that felt rehearsed, asking about his sleep, his plans, her eyes scanning his face for signs of suspicion. He answered calmly, offering nothing that might reveal the calculations running beneath his composure. Inside, he noted every inconsistency, every fraction of a second where her smile lagged behind her words. She moved through the apartment with proprietary ease, checking drawers under the guise of tidying, her body language confident and unhurried. Lucas watched without comment, understanding that this performance was meant to reassure her more than him. He felt the strange clarity that comes when illusion dissolves, leaving behavior stark and readable. This, he realized, was how she had always seen him, as part of the furniture she controlled. They spoke about paperwork as if it were a minor inconvenience, something that required patience rather than urgency. She told him there had been delays, complications beyond her control, and he nodded at the appropriate moments. Lucas noticed how she avoided specifics, how every explanation floated just long enough to seem plausible before drifting into vagueness. He remembered how he used to cling to those explanations, grateful for any reassurance offered. Now he felt detached, as though watching a familiar scene with new eyes. The detachment did not numb him. It sharpened his perception. He asked a single, carefully chosen question and saw her shoulders tense almost imperceptibly before she recovered. That tension told him more than her answer ever could. It confirmed that she had not expected resistance, even subtle resistance. After she left again, Lucas allowed himself to breathe more freely, though he did not relax. He understood that confrontation without preparation would only restore her advantage. Instead, he began to reach outward in small, deliberate ways, testing the boundaries she had drawn around his life. He visited a public office she had discouraged him from approaching alone, discovering that the receptionist spoke to him without suspicion or condescension. He learned which questions could be asked without documentation, which names carried weight, which procedures required oversight. Each interaction chipped away at the narrative she had constructed for him, replacing it with something sturdier. He realized how much power came from simply being seen as a person rather than a problem. That recognition fueled his resolve more than anger ever could. Lucas also began to listen more carefully to others in similar situations, people whose quiet carried its own weight of experience. He did not reveal his story fully, but he absorbed theirs, noting patterns that echoed his own. There were always intermediaries, always promises of protection that came at the cost of autonomy. He heard about documents withheld for safekeeping, about silence framed as survival, about gratitude demanded as proof of worth. The familiarity was unsettling but instructive. It told him that what was happening to him was not an isolated misunderstanding, but part of a larger, quieter exploitation. That knowledge steadied him, anchoring his experience in something shared rather than shameful. He understood then that visibility could be collective, not just personal. The thought shifted something fundamental in how he saw his options. One evening, as he returned to the apartment. Lucas noticed a car parked across the street that had not been there before. It was unremarkable, the kind of vehicle designed to blend in, but its presence lingered in his awareness. He did not stare or slow his pace, trusting the instincts he had honed long before crossing any border. Inside, he found the apartment unchanged, but the sense of being observed did not fade. He sat in the dim light, considering whether the car was coincidence or confirmation. Either possibility required caution, not panic. He reminded himself that fear thrived on imagination unchecked by evidence. Still, he cataloged the detail carefully, adding it to the growing map in his mind. Maps, he knew, were how one navigated uncertainty, without surrendering to it. That night, Lucas reviewed everything he had learned, laying it out mentally with methodical care. He saw now how her confidence depended on his isolation, how every boundary she enforced narrowed his field of vision. By stepping beyond those boundaries, even quietly, he had already disrupted her control. The realization did not make him reckless. It made him patient. He understood that the most effective resistance often looked like compliance until the moment it mattered. He allowed himself a small, private acknowledgement of his own resilience, something he had denied himself for too long. Surviving had required adaptation, but living would require assertion. The distinction felt newly urgent. He knew that when the moment came, hesitation would be more dangerous than action. In the days that followed, her demeanor toward him shifted subtly, becoming more attentive, more watchful. She asked questions with renewed interest, probing for changes he refused to reveal. Lucas responded with the same calm cooperation, offering nothing that could be used against him. Inside, he tracked her behavior like data, noting spikes in concern and lapses in confidence. He realized that she sensed the shift even if she could not name it. Control, once disrupted, became anxious and brittle. He saw flashes of irritation beneath her practiced composure, moments when she pushed too hard and then pulled back. Those moments told him he was closer than she realized. The imbalance she relied on was no longer stable. One afternoon, Lucas received a call from an unfamiliar number, the voice on the other end measured and cautious. The conversation was brief, filled with careful language and unspoken implications. When it ended, Lucas sat very still, absorbing what had been confirmed. His passport was not lost in bureaucracy or delay. It was being held deliberately, its absence serving a purpose he had only partially understood. The confirmation sent a chill through him, not of fear, but of clarity. He finally knew where the line had been crossed, and by whom. The knowledge did not overwhelm him. It focused him. He realized that the next step would change everything, whether he chose silence or truth. As evening fell, Lucas stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Each light represented a life unfolding beyond his immediate reach, indifferent to his dilemma, yet connected by shared space. He felt the weight of choice settle fully on his shoulders, heavy but unmistakably his own. He understood that speaking out would carry risk, but remaining silent would cost him something irretrievable. The decision no longer felt abstract. It pressed against him with tangible urgency. He thought of the ensign note, of the assumption behind it, and felt a steady resolve take hold. Lucas knew now that invisibility was no longer an option he was willing to accept. Lucas woke before dawn with the certainty that the waiting phase had ended, even if nothing visible had changed. The apartment felt tighter, its walls pressing in with a familiarity that now felt accusatory rather than protective. He moved quietly, aware that every habit he repeated could be read as submission if he allowed it to be. As he washed his face, he studied his reflection, noticing the exhaustion around his eyes and the steadiness beneath it. Fear still existed, but it no longer dictated the terms of his behavior. He recognized this internal shift as the most dangerous development for her, even if she had not yet named it. Control depended on predictability, and Lucas was no longer predictable. That realization followed him as he dressed and prepared to leave. Outside, the city felt different in the early morning, stripped of its usual noise and urgency. Lucas walked without a specific destination, letting movement itself become a form of thinking. He replayed the phone call in his mind, the careful pauses, the implications left unsaid. Whoever had called him had known enough to confirm his suspicions, but not enough to offer protection. It was an exchange designed to inform, not to intervene. Lucas understood then that no one was coming to rescue him from this situation. The responsibility for what happened next rested entirely with him. That understanding was sobering, but also clarified his purpose. He was no longer waiting for permission to act. He stopped at a public library and sat among strangers who paid him no attention. The anonymity allowed him to think clearly, away from the apartment's silent surveillance. He began to write, not messages or accusations, but a precise account of events as he remembered them. Dates, conversations, promises, omissions, all laid out without emotion or embellishment. Writing forced him to confront the full scope of what had happened, stripping away the justifications he had once offered on her behalf. The process was unsettling, but it grounded him in facts rather than feelings. He realized how easily memory could be distorted by fear and gratitude. By fixing his story in words, he reclaimed authority over it. That act alone felt like a quiet rebellion. As he wrote, Lucas noticed patterns he had not fully acknowledged before. Moments when she isolated him coincided with increased urgency around his documents. Periods of reassurance followed instances where he had nearly asserted himself. The rhythm of control became obvious once he stepped back far enough to see a whole. He felt a restrained anger at his own earlier compliance, but he did not dwell on it. Blame, he knew, would only slow him down. What mattered was recognition, and recognition had arrived. He closed a notebook and sat with the weight of it, understanding that truth, once recorded, became harder to erase. The thought gave him a measure of calm he had not expected. Calm, he realized, was its own form of resistance. When Lucas returned to the apartment later that day, she was there waiting for him. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes sharpened when she saw him, searching for signs of defiance. She asked where he had been, her tone light but insistent, and he answered truthfully without elaboration. The simplicity of his response unsettled her more than a lie would have. He could see it in the way she shifted her weight, in the way her smile tightened. She reminded him, gently, of the risks he faced, of how fragile his situation remained. Lucas listened without interrupting, letting her words wash over him without absorption. He understood now that fear was her primary currency. Without it, her leverage diminished. The conversation ended without resolution, suspended in a politeness that felt brittle. Afterward, Lucas sat alone, replaying every word exchanged, noting what had been said and what had been carefully avoided. She had not threatened him outright, but the implication hovered between them, heavy and unmistakable. He realized that she believed ambiguity would keep him compliant. What she did not see was that ambiguity no longer paralyzed him. It clarified his next move. He understood that direct confrontation would come, but not yet. Preparation, not reaction, would determine the outcome. That night, Lucas slept briefly and dreamed of the border he had crossed, the line drawn in dirt and wire that had once seemed like the end of one life and the beginning of another. In the dream, the line shifted, moving closer no matter how far he walked. He woke with the image still vivid, understanding its meaning immediately. The border had never been just a place. It was a condition imposed by others whenever they decided who belonged. He sat up in the dark, feeling the old fear stir and then recede. He was tired of living, as if every step required permission. The dream did not frighten him. It warned him. Over the next few days, Lucas continued to gather information quietly, speaking only when necessary and listening whenever possible. He learned which offices kept records, which processes left trails that could be followed. He learned who asked questions and who avoided them. Each piece of information added to his sense of orientation, like landmarks appearing on an unfamiliar road. He did not rush, trusting that haste would only benefit those already in power. Patience had been forced on him before. Now he wielded it deliberately. He felt himself growing more solid, less reactive. This was not the numbness of despair, but the steadiness of intention. Her behavior grew more erratic as the silence deepened. She checked him more often, her concern edging toward suspicion. Lucas responded with the same measured calm, refusing to give her the reassurance she sought. He could see the strain this caused her, the way her confidence frayed at the edges. Control, he understood, required constant reinforcement. Without feedback, it weakened. He did not take pleasure in her discomfort, but he recognized its significance. The balance between them was shifting, and she felt it even if she could not name it. One evening, Lucas found another note where the first had been, this one longer, more explanatory, and still unsigned. It framed his situation as precarious, his dependence as unavoidable, and her actions as necessary. As he read it, Lucas felt an unexpected clarity settle over him. The note was not meant to inform him. It was meant to remind him of his place. Instead, it confirmed how deeply she underestimated him. He folded the paper carefully and placed it beside his own written account. The contrast between them told him everything he needed to know. In that moment, Lucas understood that the next step would no longer be silent, and once taken, it could not be undone. Lucas began to act with intention the following morning. Not hurried, not dramatic, but deliberate in a way that felt irreversible. He left the apartment carrying only what he could justify if questioned, the rest hidden where it would not be easily found. Each step down the stairwell felt heavier than the last, not with fear, but with the awareness that he was stepping out of a role he had been assigned without consent. Outside, the city moved around him with its usual indifference, unaware that a private line had been crossed. Lucas did not look back at the building, understanding that nostalgia could weaken resolve. He focused instead on the sequence of actions ahead, each one dependent on the last. This was no longer about reclaiming a document. It was about reclaiming authorship over his own life. That clarity steadied him more than reassurance ever had. His first stop was an office he had avoided until now, a place that smelled of paper and stale air and institutional patience. He waited his turn among others whose eyes carried variations of the same fatigue, the same guarded hope. When his name was called, he spoke carefully, offering facts without embellishment, answering questions without apology. He felt the subtle shift when the person across from him stopped seeing him as a problem and began to see him as a case. That distinction mattered. It meant his story had entered a system larger than her control. The process was slow, procedural, and unsentimental, but it was real. Lucas left with forms to complete and instructions to follow, tangible proof that silence was not the only path to survival as the day unfolded. Lucas moved through spaces she had once framed as dangerous, discovering instead their neutrality. He spoke to a counselor recommended quietly by someone who had no stake in his fear. He listened as options were outlined without urgency or manipulation. Each conversation stripped away another layer of inevitability she had wrapped around his situation. He understood that the world was not kind, but it was not uniformly hostile either. There were gaps in the structures of control, places where authority did not reach as far as it claimed. Learning this did not make him naive. It made him strategic. He began to see how her power relied on his belief in her indispensability. Without that belief, her influence thinned rapidly. When Lucas returned to the apartment that evening, he sensed confrontation waiting like a hell breath. She was there, seated at the table, his absence having clearly unsettled her. She asked where he had been, her tone sharpened now, stripped of its earlier softness. Lucas answered honestly, no longer cushioning the truth for her comfort. The admission landed between them with visible impact, her composure faltering before she recovered. She warned him again, this time less subtly, about consequences he could not control. Lucas listened, noting how her words relied on implication rather than fact. He realized that threats lost potency once they were examined closely. Her certainty was cracking, and she knew it. The argument that followed was restrained but charged, each sentence measured and loaded. She accused him of ingratitude, of misunderstanding her intentions, of risking everything they had built. Lucas did not raise his voice or defend himself emotionally. He stated what he knew, what he had confirmed, and what he was prepared to do next. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Her anger flared, then receded into something colder, more calculating. He saw in her expression the moment she recalculated his value, no longer as a compliant beneficiary, but as a liability. That shift frightened him less than it might have before. Fear, he had learned, was most dangerous when it was vague. That night, Lucas did not sleep in the apartment. He left quietly, taking only what he needed, trusting that absence would speak louder than confrontation. He stayed with someone who asked few questions and offered no judgments, a kindness that felt unfamiliar but welcome. In the unfamiliar room, he lay awake, listening to different walls breathe, different pipes hum. The change unsettled him, but also confirmed that movement was possible. He reviewed the day's events, noting where he felt fear and where he had felt resolve. The balance had shifted decisively toward the latter. He understood now that safety was not a static condition, but an ongoing negotiation with reality, and he had finally entered that negotiation on his own terms. In the days that followed, messages from her grew more frequent, alternating between concern and veiled hostility. Lucas did not respond immediately, choosing instead to let time recalibrate the dynamic. He knew that engagement on her terms would only restore patterns he was trying to break. Instead, he focused on completing forms, attending appointments, and following through on the processes he had initiated. Each completed step reinforced his sense of agency. The work was tedious and slow, but it was honest. He felt himself becoming visible in ways that mattered, documented not as a favor granted, but as a person asserting presence. That distinction carried weight. Eventually, she demanded to meet, framing it as necessary and urgent. Lucas agreed, but only in a public place, setting boundaries she could not ignore. The meeting was tense, her frustration barely contained beneath forced civility. She accused him of betrayal, of jeopardizing himself unnecessarily. Lucas listened, and then spoke calmly, outlining what he knew she had done and what he had already set in motion. He did not threaten, he informed. The effect was profound. He saw fear flicker across her face, quickly masked but unmistakable. In that moment, Lucas understood that power had changed hands, not dramatically, but decisively. As they parted, Lucas felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. The confrontation had not resolved everything, but it had clarified the terrain. He knew there would be consequences, complications, and setbacks ahead, but he also knew that returning to silence was no longer possible. He walked away from the meeting with a steadiness that surprised him, aware that something essential had been reclaimed. The central question was no longer whether she would let him go, but how much of what she had taken he could now recover. And for the first time, that question felt answerable. The days after the meeting settled into an uneasy quiet that Lucas understood was temporary. Silence, he had learned, was never neutral in situations like this. It was a recalibration period, a pause while power assessed its next move. He kept his routines minimal and intentional, changing locations often enough to avoid predictability, but not so often as to attract attention. Each morning began with the same grounding ritual, a reminder that he was still moving forward even when nothing visible seemed to change. He monitored his phone carefully, noting patterns in the messages she sent and the ones she abruptly stopped sending. The shift from pressure to restraint told him more than escalation would have. It meant she was weighing risk, calculating exposure, and considering who else might now be watching. Lucas took quiet comfort in that knowledge. He received confirmation from the office he had visited earlier, a procedural update that carried no emotion but immense significance. His situation had been formally logged, his account entered into a system that did not rely on personal loyalty or gratitude. Reading the message, Lucas felt a cautious relief that did not blossom into optimism, but settled into something steadier. This was not resolution, but it was traction. He understood how slow institutional processes could be, how easily they could falter under pressure. Still, they offered something her control never had: accountability. The thought that his story now existed beyond private conversations felt like a protective layer he had not known he needed. It did not erase danger, but it redistributed it. Lucas began to notice changes in himself that felt both subtle and profound. He spoke more directly, hesitated less when asking questions, and no longer softened his words to manage others' reactions. This shift did not make him reckless, but it did make him visible. Visibility carried its own risks, but also disrupted the assumptions that had once kept him contained. He reflected on how long he had mistaken adaptability for erasure, believing survival required shrinking. Now he understood that adaptation could also mean expansion, choosing when and how to occupy space. This realization did not come with triumph, but with a sober acceptance of responsibility. He was no longer merely reacting to circumstances. He was shaping them. That agency felt heavy, but it was unmistakably his. One afternoon, Lucas encountered someone who recognized him from the building where he had lived with her. The conversation was brief and polite, but it carried an undercurrent of awareness that unsettled him. He wondered how much had been observed, what narratives had circulated quietly while he remained silent. The encounter reminded him that isolation had never been complete. It had simply been controlled. He considered the possibility that others might now be reinterpreting his departure, reassessing their own assumptions. The thought did not comfort him, but it reinforced his understanding that stories did not remain contained. They traveled, changed shape, and accumulated meaning as they moved. That movement could be dangerous, but it could also expose truths that secrecy relied on. Lucas resolved to be deliberate about what he allowed to circulate. Her attempts to contact him shifted again, becoming sparse but pointed. Each message crafted to provoke a response. He read them without replying, noting how their tone alternated between familiarity and threat. It was a language he now recognized clearly, designed to reassert dominance through emotional recall. Lucas felt the pull of old habits, the reflex to explain himself, to soothe tension before it escalated. He resisted it, understanding that engagement on those terms would only reopen pathways he had worked to close. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a boundary. That distinction mattered. He allowed himself to feel the discomfort of not responding, trusting that endurance was sometimes more powerful than confrontation. At night, memories surfaced uninvited, fragments of earlier vulnerability that carried renewed significance. He remembered the relief he had felt when she first offered help, the gratitude that had softened his skepticism. He examined those memories without self-reproach, recognizing how desperation narrowed perception. The exercise was painful but necessary. It allowed him to separate his past needs from her actions, to see where genuine assistance had ended and exploitation had begun. This clarity did not absolve him of risk, but freed him from shame. Shame, he realized, had been one of her most effective tools. Without it, her influence diminished further. Lucas also became aware of the toll the situation had taken on his body. The chronic tension that had once felt normal now revealing itself through fatigue and restlessness. He began to care for himself in small, practical ways, eating regularly, sleeping when he could, and allowing moments of rest without guilt. These acts felt almost subversive, a refusal to remain in constant readiness. He understood that endurance required maintenance, not just resolve. The idea that he deserved care, even in uncertainty, felt unfamiliar but grounding. It reinforced the sense that his life was no longer suspended, waiting for permission to resume. It was happening, unevenly but undeniably. As the weeks progressed, Lucas received another update, this one more substantial, outlining next steps and potential outcomes. None of them were guaranteed, and all required patience. He read the document carefully, absorbing its implications without rushing to interpret them as victory. What mattered was that the process continued, that momentum had not stalled. He thought of how often she had framed delay as danger, using uncertainty to enforce dependence. Now, delay felt different. It was frustrating, but it was transparent. He could see its contours, its limits. That visibility transformed waiting from paralysis into preparation. One evening, as Lucas walked through a crowded street, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched again. This time, however, the feeling did not trigger panic. He scanned his surroundings calmly, noting faces, movements, and exits. Whether the attention was real or imagined mattered less than his response to it. He did not alter his pace or direction, refusing to let fear dictate his movement. The city absorbed him as it always had, indifferent and vast. In that moment, Lucas understood that the greatest shift had already occurred within him. He was no longer living in anticipation of control, but an awareness of his own capacity to resist it. The mystery was no longer whether she would act again, but how far she would go now that silence no longer worked. Lucas understood that resolution rarely announced itself, that it crept closer through accumulation rather than revelation. The waiting had sharpened him, not dulled him, and he felt the difference in how he moved through each day. He no longer scanned every room with the same quiet dread, though awareness never fully left him. Instead, he carried a steadier vigilance, one that did not consume his thoughts or fracture his sleep as it once had. He noticed how easily fear had once filled the empty spaces of uncertainty, and how clarity now occupied those same spaces without noise. This internal recalibration felt like the true turning point, more significant than any document or decision yet to come. He sensed that whatever happened next would test this steadiness. The thought did not weaken him. It prepared him. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, its timing almost insulting in its normalcy. Lucas stepped aside to answer, recognizing the voice immediately, though it had lost much of its former authority. She spoke carefully, too carefully, explaining that there had been complications, misunderstandings, things that now needed to be corrected. Lucas listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his attention precise. As she spoke, he heard not urgency but damage control, the sound of someone adjusting to a shrinking field of options. She mentioned his passport, framing its absence as temporary and unavoidable, a situation she was actively trying to resolve. The word slid past him without impact. He had already confirmed what mattered. Her narrative no longer defined the truth. When she finished, Lucas responded with measured clarity, stating only what he knew and what had already been set in motion. He did not accuse or threaten. He articulated boundaries. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Her composure faltered, the confidence in her tone thinning, as she realized persuasion would no longer work. Lucas felt a brief, unexpected sadness at the sound of it, not for her predicament, but for the simplicity of the illusion he had once believed in. He ended the call politely, decisively, and without invitation for further discussion. When the line went dead, he remained still for a moment, absorbing the finality of the exchange. Something had closed. He felt it settle quietly into place. The confirmation arrived days later, delivered through official channels rather than private hands. His passport had been flagged, its withholding documented, its custody traced. Reading the notice, Lucas experienced a complex surge of relief and anger, emotions that no longer overwhelmed but demanded acknowledgement. The paper trail told a story she could not erase, a record that transformed his experience from allegation into fact. He realized how much effort had gone into keeping him isolated from exactly this kind of verification. Seeing his reality reflected back through an impartial system was grounding in a way he had not anticipated. It did not vindicate him emotionally, but it stabilized him practically. The ground beneath his feet felt firmer. Lucas was asked to provide a formal statement, a comprehensive account of what had occurred. He prepared it carefully, returning to the notes he had written earlier, refining them without embellishment. As he spoke, he noticed how his voice remained steady, how the events no longer tangled themselves into confusion. This was not rehearsal or detachment. It was integration. His story had settled into coherence, no longer splintered by fear or gratitude. The person listening asked clarifying questions, not skeptical ones, and Lucas answered them without defensiveness. He understood that truth did not need protection once it was clearly articulated. That realization felt quietly profound. It marked the distance he had traveled since the night he found the drawer empty. In the days that followed, consequences unfolded beyond his direct involvement. He heard fragments through official updates and careful conversations, enough to understand that her influence had not been as contained as she believed. Others had come forward, their stories intersecting with his in unsettlingly familiar ways. Lucas felt the weight of that knowledge settle on him, heavy but clarifying. His experience was not singular. It was part of a pattern sustained by silence. The recognition carried responsibility, one he did not seek but could not ignore. He reflected on how easily systems of control thrived when individuals remained isolated. Speaking had not only altered his circumstances, it had disrupted a structure. That understanding reframed his fear into something closer to purpose. Despite the progress, uncertainty remained, its edges still sharp. Legal processes moved slowly, outcomes remained provisional, and stability was not yet guaranteed. Lucas did not romanticize his phase, understanding that endurance still mattered. But endurance no longer felt like suspension. He had anchors now, points of reference that grounded him when doubts surfaced. He began to imagine a future not defined solely by recovery, but by choice. The idea felt tentative, almost fragile, but it existed. That alone marked a profound shift. He was no longer merely surviving the aftermath. He was orienting himself toward what came next. One evening, Lucas returned to the street where he had first noticed the unremarkable car weeks earlier. It was gone now, replaced by the ordinary flux of traffic and strangers. The absence did not reassure him completely, but it no longer unsettled him. He stood there for a moment, observing the movement around him, feeling his own presence within it. He realized that fear had once narrowed his world to a single apartment, a single voice. Now, his world felt broader, messier, and more honest. The thought carried a quiet satisfaction. Control had relied on containment, and containment had failed. As the final confirmations began to arrive, Lucas felt the full weight of what had been reclaimed. His passport would be returned, his status corrected, his autonomy restored in tangible ways. The resolution was not dramatic, not cinematic, but it was real. He understood that what had been taken from him was not only documentation, but narrative control. That control had been returned not through confrontation alone, but through persistence and clarity. The realization settled into him with lasting force. He knew that the story would not end neatly. That residue would remain. But he also knew that some stories survive only because someone chooses to tell them, and he had finally chosen to tell his. The return of the passport happened without ceremony, handed across a counter by someone who did not know the cost of its absence. Lucas accepted it with steady hands, feeling the weight of the small booklet settle into his palm like a closing circuit. It was unchanged in appearance, its pages still crisp, its cover still worn at the edges from earlier travels. Yet its meaning had shifted entirely. It was no longer a symbol of vulnerability or leverage, but of continuity reclaimed. Lucas thanked the clerk and stepped outside, pausing briefly as if to recalibrate himself to the world beyond the building. The city greeted him with its usual indifference, and for the first time, that indifference felt like permission rather than threat. He walked for a long time afterward, allowing the day to absorb the significance of what had been resolved. The mystery that had once hollowed his nights had not ended in revelation, but in confirmation. She had taken his passport deliberately, believing his fear would keep him silent and compliant. She had relied on his invisibility, on his assumption that survival required gratitude rather than truth. That assumption had been her miscalculation. Lucas had seen enough, pieced together enough, to understand the structure beneath her kindness. The note, the moved documents, the silences were no longer fragments of confusion, but evidence of a system that thrived on quiet control. Naming it had dismantled its power. He thought about her only briefly, not with triumph or hatred, but with sober clarity. Whatever consequences she faced would unfold beyond his control, shaped by systems larger than either of them. He understood now that resolution did not require her acknowledgement or remorse. It required distance, documentation, and a refusal to carry shame that was never his to begin with. That refusal felt like the final severing of the bond she had relied on. Lucas did not need to confront her again. The truth had already done that work for him. What remained was a quieter task of moving forward without the weight of her narrative pressing against his back. In the weeks that followed, Lucas settled into a life that felt both unfamiliar and grounded. Routine returned, but it was no longer imposed. It was chosen. He attended appointments, completed procedures, and began to imagine plans that extended beyond immediate survival. These plans were modest, cautious, and deliberately his own. He noticed how his body responded to the absence of constant vigilance, how tension loosened incrementally rather than all at once. Healing, he realized, was not a single moment, but a series of small permissions granted to oneself. He granted them slowly, aware that Russia would only recreate patterns he was leaving behind. Stability, when it came, felt earned rather than borrowed. Lucas also began to speak more openly, not publicly or dramatically, but honestly when the moment required it. He learned that telling his story did not diminish it. It clarified it. Others listened, some in recognition, others in disbelief, but the telling itself anchored him. Each retelling stripped away residual fear, leaving behind a narrative he could inhabit without flinching. He understood now that silence had preserved the illusion that what happened to him was isolated or deserved. Speech revealed its context, its patterns, its human cost. This understanding did not harden him. It steadied him. He no longer feared being seen. One evening, Lucas returned to the apartment for the last time to collect what remained of his belongings. The space felt smaller than he remembered, its careful order now transparent in its purpose. He moved through the rooms without hesitation, gathering objects that had once felt charged with dependency. Nothing resisted him. The place held no power now, only echoes. As he closed the door behind him, he did not pause or look back. Some endings required no ceremony. Walking away was enough. Outside, the city stretched before him, imperfect and indifferent and vast. Lucas felt the weight of the past recede, not erased, but integrated into something sturdier. He understood that what he had survived would always be part of him, shaping how he saw the world and himself. But it would not define the limits of his life. The border he had crossed was no longer the most significant line he had navigated. The more important one had been internal, drawn between silence and voice. He had crossed that too. As Lucas disappeared into the movement of the street, his story did not conclude so much as continue, carried forward by the choice he had made. The mystery that once threatened to erase him had instead revealed what endurance, clarity, and persistence could accomplish. He knew there would be other challenges, other moments that tested his resolve. But he also knew that some stories survive only because someone chooses to tell them. Lucas had chosen, and that choice would outlast the fear that once tried to contain him. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about survival, truth, and the quiet courage it takes to reclaim your voice.